Okay, so today what we're going to work on is writing the equation of a function given imaginary roots. So, well, actually given imaginary and real roots. So, I would like you to try this. We've done this before. So, put me on pause and then come back and check your answer. Okay, so let's take a look at the first one. I have all real, rational, these are all real and rational here. I have a root of, or a 0 of 0, 3, and negative 4/5. So I'm going to take them all and set it equal to x. Okay, so when I have real rational roots, I want to factor backwards. So I'm going to take this middle one here and make it x minus. So I have x minus 3 equals 0. And for the fraction, I'm going to cross multiply. So it would be 5x is equal to negative 4. Add 4, I get 5x plus 4 is equal to 0. Okay, so I have here x times x minus 3. So these are all my factors, times 5x plus 4. All right, so now I'm going to distribute the x. So I get x squared minus 3x. And then I have to multiply that by 5x plus 4. So I'll double distribute. So we have x squared times 5x would be 5x to the third. X squared times 4 would be 4x squared. Negative 3x times 5x is negative 15x squared. And negative 3x times 4 would be negative 12x. Combine like terms, so I get 5x to the third. Positive 4x squared minus 15x squared is negative 11x squared. And then I have minus 12x, and we want to write this as a function, so it would be f of x is equal to 5x to the third minus 11x squared minus 12x. Okay, so let's look at the second one. So I have one rational root, and I have imaginary roots, irrational roots here. So I have x equals 0. And then I also have x is equal to 3 plus minus the square root of 6. They're conjugates. So anytime you have an irrational root, you'll always have conjugates here. And the same thing for imaginary, which we're going to work on in a few minutes. All right, so I'm going to start with my irrational. So I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides. So x minus 3 is equal to plus minus the square root of 6. So remember, we're going to complete the square backwards. So now I'm going to square both sides. So when I square the radical, they cancel each other out, so I'm left with just 6. And when I square x minus 3, I get x squared minus 6x plus 9. And now I'm going to subtract 6 from both sides. I get x squared minus 6x plus 3 is equal to 0. So now I have to take that and multiply it by x, by my other factor. So I'm going to distribute the x. I get x to the third minus 6x squared plus 3x. And we want to write it as a function, so I write it as f of x. So it's f of x is equal to x to the third minus 6x squared plus 3x. All right, so now let's talk about the imaginary. So let's solve this equation over here by completing the square. So I have x squared plus 2x plus 5 is equal to 0. So I'm going to solve this. Find my zeros, find my roots. So I get x squared plus 2x is equal to negative 5. And then I do half of 2, I get 1. Square it, I get 1. I add that to both sides. So I get x squared plus 2x plus 1 is equal to negative 5 plus 1. Negative 5 plus 1 is negative 4. And then when I factor this, I get x plus 1 squared. So it's x plus 1 squared is equal to negative 4. So to get rid of the square, I square root both sides. So I get x plus 1 equals plus minus the square root of negative 4. But the square root of negative 4, remember the negative under the radical becomes I, and the square root of 4 is 2. So it's plus minus 2I equals x plus 1. And then subtract 1, and I get x is equal to negative 1 plus minus 2i. Okay, so now I'm going to give you the roots, and we're going to go backwards. So what you want to remember is that to have an I, you would have to have a negative under the radical. Okay, so that was probably the most important thing to remember. So here are my zeros over here. 2, so I have a real rational root, a real rational 0, and I have 2 imaginary zeros, right? The conjugates of each other, 3i and negative 3i. So I have x equals 2. I'm just going to move everything. So x was equal to 2. And x is equal to plus minus 3i. Okay, so the x equals 2, that's actually x minus 2, right? That's my factor. Over here on the right side, I'm going to work backwards to complete the square. So this is x is equal to, so think about where this would have had to come from. Then the I would have to come from having a negative under the radical. And the 3 would have to have, I would have to have a 9 under the radical. So I get a plus minus 3i there. So now I'm going to square both sides to get rid of the radical. So I have x squared is equal to negative 9. Add 9, I get x squared plus 9 equals 0. So that's a factor. So I have x minus 2 times x squared plus 9. And now I'm going to double distribute. X to the third plus 9x minus 2x squared minus 18. And let's just put it in the right order, and we'll write it as a function. So it would be f of x is equal to x to the third minus 2x squared plus 9x minus 18. Okay, and let's try number 2. So I have imaginary roots here, imaginary zeros, and a real 0. So I have x equals 0, and x is equal to 5 plus minus I, the square root of 3. All right, so I'm going to hold off on the x equals 0 because I already have my factor. It's just x over here. So on the right side, I'm going to subtract 5. So I get x minus 5 equals plus minus I, the square root of 3. The I would come from having a negative under the radical. So x minus 5 equals plus minus the square root of negative 3. Now I'm going to square both sides to get rid of the square root. So they cancel each other out. So I'm left with just 3, negative 3, sorry. And then I have to double distribute here. X minus 5 times x minus 5 is x squared minus 10x plus 25. And then add 3 to both sides. And I get x squared minus 10x plus 28 equals 0. And now I have to multiply that by my other factor, which is x, and write it as a function. So it's f of x equals x to the third minus 10x squared plus 28x. Okay, so that's it, and we'll practice in class tomorrow. Have a good night.